It's the summer of 1986 and the heat is on. People are flocking to the seaside to try to catch some sun. Invisible Touch by Genesis and Papa Don't Preach by Madonna are hitting the radio waves. Queen had commenced their magic tour across Europe and Prince Andrew marries Sarah Ferguson. Amongst houses in the suburbs was a nuclear fallout shelter in someone's back garden, and this belonged to the Etcher family. Marcus Etcher bought it in response of looming nuclear warfare during the intense height of the Cold War circa 1979, and now it's used as an outside fort for son Frankie. Frankie used it for a hangout with the neighbor's children, including his best friend from school Richie and Tomo, an Israeli who recently came to the UK. They played stuff like Pirates because they seen the Goonies, and Army because of their viewing of some movies about the Vietnam War. The trio were quite adventurous and sometimes end up in places that shouldn't be at because of their young age. Recently they sneaked in at the local cinema and got to watch Aliens. One of their neighbors, Mrs. Egmont, was part of that grassroots charitable movement called Neighborhood Watch Today, which people start working together to build safer, vibrant and inclusive communities, help prevent crime and make a positive, sustainable difference in communities. Frankie and Richie thought it was meaningless, especially from the elders who try and prevent their fun when on the streets. Thankfully that nuclear fallout shelter became a bubble of fun activity away from the overbearing influence of the elderly neighbors. That night Frankie woke up with a startle when a flashing erupted from his window and climbed out of bed to see what was going on. He opened the curtains and saw smoke fumes in the distance. He questioned himself what it could be. An aeroplane, or was it something dangerous? His curiosity got the best of him and decided to go out and see for himself. He sneakily walked out the house and headed to the crash site. There was a crater the size of a large jacuzzi, and in it was a small rustic pod. Frankie leaned towards it until its hatch opened and quickly scampered out of sight. He hid nearby and watched as three beings of extraterrestrial physiology crawled out of the wreckage. He couldn't understand what they were saying, as their supposed language consisted of clicks, grunts and warbles. Suddenly he accidentally lost his balance while kneeling down and fell onto his backside. This made the aliens come over to his orbit and headed to the hiding place. Frankie froze like a statue and come face to face with them. One of the aliens picked him up and held him closely to its face. He winced and had the dreadful thought that it'll eat him. But it didn't and gently placed him down. Frankie was baffled by this and asked why didn't it eat him. The alien looked puzzled and turned back to the other two. It then brought its hand out and nodded its head to Frankie. He wasn't sure about this but proceeded to shake the alien's hand, probably thinking it means no harm, and slowly smiled at this revelation. He never met anything like it, only on TV or the big screen. He then asked them to follow him. The aliens just stood there and then he made a hand gesture to follow him. He brought them to his back garden and made some hand gestures to get them in the nuclear fallout shelter. They do so and Frankie says to them that they'll be safe here. The next morning Frankie called Richie and Tomo by phone to get over at his place. Both boys come over and Frankie brings them to the back garden. He opens up the fallout shelter and all three enter in. It looked empty and Tomo said there's nothing here. Suddenly the three aliens popped out of the shadows and Richie and Tomo screamed in terror. Frankie reassured them that the aliens are friendly and that they are seeking refuge. The TARDIS lands on the pier and the Doctor steps out with his arms spread out in a pleased manner. Bournemouth, and it's during summertime. Louisa came out and asked if this was Blackpool as they intended to be. He turned swiftly to her and said no. The TARDIS took a slight detour and then he pointed north, saying Blackpool is that way. Louisa leaned over the pier and looked over at the people lying down on the sand. The Doctor leaned over her and suggested that they should go down. Louisa agreed and proceeded to head to the beach. Frankie, Richie and Tomo started getting supplies for the three alien refugees. They managed to wrangle various tinned foods including fruit, sardines and even cat food. Mrs. Egmont was walking down the street with one of her neighbors, Mrs. Fenella, and caught eye on the three boys going in and out of the back garden. She questioned them why they were in a scattered rush. Tomo panicky stayed silent. Richie blurted out a couple of noises and Frankie quickly said they are feeding a couple of stray cats. Mrs. Fenella chimed in and said that Dr. Etchells knows a place where they keep stray cats. They should speak to him about it, and Frankie nodded his head. Both parties parted, but Mrs. Egmont had some suspicions about those boys and Mrs. Fenella tried to distract her about her lemon drizzle cake recipe. The Doctor and Louisa were sat on the beach. The Doctor was reading issue 473 of 2000 AD while Louisa was lying on her front sunbathing. She asked him to put some lotion on her back. He does so while still reading but picks up the wrong bottle. Instead of lotion it was a bottle of Tizer and pours it on her back. Louisa let out a yelp and quickly got up. She covered her breasts with her arms and looked at him angrily. He apologized to her but ended up with a towel thrown in his face. A couple who were sunbathing nearby were talking about the recently discovered crater and this piqued the doctor's interest. He headed over and asked about it. The woman said that it only happened 2 days ago and the authorities had sealed it off. The man questioned the doctor's curiosity and the doctor said he's an archaeologist with Louisa as his student. Richie was riding his bike and was going to pass the sealed off area where the crater was until he quickly stopped in his tracks. He saw the doctor and Louisa enter the area. He hid out of sight and watched them survey the crater. The doctor was picking up soil and said to Louisa that it was charred by thrusters of kind of spacecraft. Richie lost his balance while kneeling and made a thud when he fell on his backside. Louisa heard this and headed over to where Richie was spying. He quickly raced off and pedaled off back to Frankie's. He raced to the back garden where Frankie was in the bunker. He was trying to work the antenna on a small portable radio to get a signal for Radio 1 and Richie came in with his heart racing. Frankie asked what's up and Richie said that a couple were investigating the crater. Frankie wondered if the authorities had taken notice of the landing and that a major search party was being conducted. He ordered Richie to go home and that he'll persuade the aliens that they'll be shut in for amount of time until it dies down. Richie agrees and pedals back home. The doctor and Louisa were walking down the street when they noticed Richie on his bike. Richie saw them and quickly pedaled off. The doctor then turned to Frankie's house and decided to go over. He knocked on the door and a lean, strong man in his mid-20s opened the door. The doctor questioned about the boy on the bike and the lean man said he's called Richie, a friend of his younger Frankie. Louisa clocked onto him and the lean man looked back at her. The doctor clicked his finger in front of his face to get his attention and the lean man called Joseph or Joe to his mates came to his senses. The doctor asked if he can come in and Joe agreed. Frankie was in the sitting room watching television when Joe entered in and introduces the doctor and Louisa to him. Joe and Louisa quickly went off together upstairs while the doctor proceeded with a conversation to Frankie. He asked about his friend Richie and how he was watching them from afar at the area of the crater. Frankie didn't comment about this and tried to distract himself from the conversation. The doctor did get distracted by the sight of the nuclear fallout shelter and headed to the back garden. Frankie got a bit frantic and tried to dissuade the doctor from entering it. The doctor told him that there is something in there and wants to see what it is. Frankie had to give in and let the doctor see. Before he could do, a moaning sound echoed from the bathroom. Louisa stuck her out of the bathroom window and spat out of the window. She said it isn't toothpaste and the doctor rolled his eyes at this while Frankie gave a cringe look of discomfort. The doctor used the sonic screwdriver on the padlock and opened it. He entered in and suddenly gets pounced by the 3 alien refugees. Frankie came in and states that the doctor is a snitch and that he'll imprison them in captive. The doctor denies all of this and starts making weird noises. The aliens put him down and moved slowly back. The doctor looked at them moodily and says that they are escaped criminals. He knew about this a while back of a missing escape pod from a prison embedded in an asteroid in the Clusker system. He then looks at their collarbones. They had 4-digit numbers on them and then he turns to Frankie. He explains that these aliens were imprisoned for crimes that would be more serious than the ones on Earth. The fact that he was keeping them out sight and assisted them to not get caught will cause consequences. Even the intergalactic authorities might execute him. Frankie's blood turned cold and looked at the aliens standing in the corner. He came to the understanding of his involvement and agrees to assist the doctor in returning the aliens back to solitary confinement. Frankie turned them and let out a whimpered sorry to them. The doctor told Frankie to get Richie and Tomo to meet at the crater site. He quickly raced out of the nuclear fallout shelter and headed to the pier where the TARDIS was situated. As he raced down the street, Mrs. Egmont peered through her front window and then telephoned Mrs. Fenella about this stranger in their neighborhood. That night the doctor, Louisa, Frankie, Richie and Tomo headed to the site of the crater. The doctor brought a device he cobbled together out of junk. It was a transmitter that sends signals to spaceships that belong to authorities, and this will bring the aliens back to the prison where they escaped from. A couple of minutes passed, then a large flash of light lit up the site and a flat metal circular plate lowered down. The aliens approached it and then turned to Frankie. They held out their hands and shook, giving a gentle farewell. Suddenly the doctor heard the sound of vehicles coming in fast to the site and saw Land Rovers with unit insignias of them. The doctor was surprised by this. He never called unit and then soldiers started emerging out. They pointed their guns at the aliens and demanded Frankie, Richie and Tomo to step away. The doctor started shouting at the soldiers to put their weapons down. Richie and Tomo walked slowly over to ask what happening. Suddenly a couple of the unit troops accidentally opened fire on the boys, killing Frankie, Richie and Tomo. The aliens screamed at the sight of this and tried to kill the troops. The teleport quickly forced them back on the plate and quickly vanished into the sky. The doctor was at his most furious. He walked over the troops but they started to point their weapons at him and then he shouted out a password to them. They did drop them. The doctor snatched the guns out of the ones who shot the boys and thrown them on the ground. Louisa walked over the boys. Richie and Tomo were dead while Frankie was still breathing. She lifted his head and spoke to him. Frankie said to Louisa that she would have been a good sister-in-law to him and slowly he became lifeless. Louisa shedded a tear and the doctor kneeled next to her. He closed Frankie's eyelids with his fingers and told her softly to put Frankie's head down. Mrs. Egmont along with the neighborhood watch community turned up behind the unit troops and pointed at the doctor, saying that he was involved alien immigration, hiding the little green men under their noses and that he was a part of unit all those years ago. The doctor sternly walked up to Mrs. Egmont. Louisa tried to pull him back and Mrs. Egmont said that her two sons were involved in unit only to be killed in action during the rampage of the K-1 robot. She savagely outright blamed the doctor for this and in a swift reaction the doctor punched her in face, busting her nose. The neighborhood watch community caught her mid-fall and the doctor said that everything to do with unit is confidential. He swiftly walked off from the crowd only to quickly return to say that gossip can lead to bloodshed as what happened tonight and said she was responsible for the boys' deaths. Mrs. Egmont looked on with her nose still dripping with blood as the doctor and Louisa walked off into the night. The doctor was outside the TARDIS on the pier, letting out his rage by repeatedly hitting the TARDIS doors violently with his right fist until his knuckles bled and then slumped himself onto the ground to catch his breath. Louisa came over a little later with a couple of burgers and sat next to him. She looked at his hand and said he can't be hurting himself because of what happened before. The doctor said his emotions go in overdrive when he witnesses children get caught in the crossfire and end up dead. The young have lives to live and can evolve how they want to be, but events and consequences led to an early grave. They don't see their future in the flesh, only to ones around them to carry the memories. Louisa plucked up some courage and told him about she was once pregnant. His eyes glared and turned to her to listen in. She got pregnant when she was 16 and she made the decision to have an abortion because of an event in her life. She was scared and didn't mention the name of the father as she wanted to keep it beneath her. She got chills while thinking it and cut the conversation short. The doctor understood this and kept quiet. She turned her attention to his bloodied hand and said she'll tend to it. The doctor said the medical equipment he possesses can be dangerous. She responded with how hard can it be, and the doctor said with a slight smirk that his hand could end up amputated. She stood up and said to him to go into the TARDIS. He agrees to this and both of them walk in.